I love this painting.
Me too.
One thing I should have included is Rembrandt, maybe, because Rembrandt did some pretty amazing
That's true.
still lives too.
Mhm. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Give a couple minutes to allow some others to join us, but thank you so much for joining us this morning. All right, perfect. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us this morning for a virtual tour of the Timken. I'm so excited to have everyone here and to have our docent Karen present on some gorgeous still lifes from the Timken and beyond. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation. If you do have any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat section here in Zoom, and we'd be happy to answer those at the end of today's presentation. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can do the same if you have any questions and use the comment section there in order to ask your questions, and we'll be monitoring that as well. Lastly, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted on our social media, so our Facebook and our YouTube channel, if you would like to go back and watch this presentation again or see any other presentations done in the past through the Timken. You can check those out on our social media as well. So without further ado, as I said earlier, we're so excited to have our docent today, Karen, be presenting on still life paintings from the Timken and beyond. Thank you so much for doing this morning, Karen, and I'll go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. We're so blessed to have Samantha, graduate student and part-time instructor at UC Davis in art history. So we're very lucky to have her. Still life is one of my favorite topics. We are going to focus on some of the still life paintings we have in the Timken, but time period wise, many of the pieces I'm going to show you, the paintings I'm going to show you, were created in the 17th century. And the 17th century really is the time when still life becomes a separate genre. It's the late 16th century and early 17th century that we begin to see still life for still life's sake. And why is that? Well, part of it is the development of still life really occurs in Holland. But I do want to back up just a moment before we talk about the 17th century and tell you a little bit of the historical aspects of still life painting. Now, in Roman times and in times of antiquity, we did see over 2,000 years ago wall paintings in villas and homes of the Romans, and they had still life paintings. One of them from Herculaneum shows a beautiful jar of water and some peaches on a ledge, and it was just a still life. We also saw a lot of still life painting in manuscript illumination, and this was very prominent in the Netherlandish regions. Now, manuscript illuminations, for example, the Limburg brothers, would paint elements of decoration on pages of books, because before the mid part of the 15th century, we did not have the printing press. Now, that is with Gutenberg. And so books were handmade for the aristocracy, for members of the clergy, and so they had to be handmade. So how do you embellish them? Well, hand decorate. So they would have aspects of plants and flowers. But now we're going to fast forward. And as I mentioned, we do have many of the most important still life painters in Holland. Quickly, I need to tell you that Holland and Belgium separate about 1609 after a 39 years war with the Spanish Habsburg. And the Dutch become Protestant, and the Flemish retain their Catholic religion. Why is this important? Because Holland begins to concentrate on decorating their more middle class homes. They no longer are Catholic, they're Protestants via Calvinism and Lutheranism, and they want things that are less religious and more about decorating their homes and speaking about the beauty of spirituality. The beauty of spirituality shows us that even in a still life painting, we can have symbols or memento mori that tell us a little bit about life. Okay, so this beautiful Jan David Steheen, he worked in Flanders, in Antwerp and also in Holland. So he had a little bit of both aspects. And he incorporates over 31 flowers in this beautiful arrangement. But because I'm going to talk about it later, I'm just going to fast forward and we'll go back to this exquisite painting. Now, Jan Bruegel the Elder was the son of the great Pieter Bruegel. And we happen to have the Parable of the Sower at the Timken Museum, and it's one of our most treasured paintings. It is a religious painting, and this one, of course, is not. Jan Bruegel did paintings other than just still life. He did mythological, historical, portraiture, but he really was known for his still lifes. And they called him Velvet Bruegel. And the reason being is that he could capture the texture on even a piece of velvet that made it seem so real. Now, realism was important to the Dutch painters in the sense that they were beginning to study optics. Remember, von Leeuwenhoek invents the microscope, develops the microscope. Optical devices are being used in Holland. Holland is a very affluent country because of trading and great farming practices. They were interested in botany and science. So you see a very direct correlation between this more affluent society and their acquiring and supporting still life painting. Now, what's unusual about this Bruegel is he uses a more Italian or Spanish vessel. This would be more common in the Spanish or Italian still life, very kind of rustic. Also, this very dark background, which is again more Spanish or Italian. Why would that be? Well, we knew that Pieter Bruegel, his father, traveled. He went into Italy and Switzerland, would be today. And many of these Dutch and Flemish artists, more the Flemish, but also the Dutch artists, went into Italy and studied some of the Renaissance painters, and actually, of course, Caravaggio, where we get this concept of chiaroscuro, the light. And so we have a lot of light falling on this painting. And we have some mementos of life and religious aspects. If we have wheat, we see some wheat in some of these. I'm looking for the wheat. That really indicates the Eucharist. Another thing that's really interesting is these flowers would not all be blooming at the same time. The tulips, the iris, the carnations, the roses. And what they would do is they would study these flowers and then they would put them in these composite images. So it would be rare to see only a few types of flowers, all from one season. They usually incorporated many different types of flowers. I'm going to go on to the next painting, our own treasured Pieter Claesz. And this still life, which is in the Timken's Dutch and Flemish gallery, is one of my all-time favorites. There's so many aspects of this painting that are worth mentioning. First of all, Pieter Claesz worked in the city of Haarlem. Haarlem is a lovely city. Frans Hals worked in Haarlem, as did Willem Claes Heade, excuse me. And Haarlem, which is not too far from Amsterdam, was a really amazingly wealthy city. Lots of goods and services trading through there. It wasn't too far from Amsterdam. Many people were exploring other regions coming out of Amsterdam. And so they were bringing back Venetian glass, for example, or beautiful tapestries and carpets from North Africa, and even as far as Americas. So in this particular painting, we have what's called, well, two concepts, a breakfast scene and a smoker's requisite. Well, what does that mean? Okay, the breakfast elements we see in this magnificent painting is a cup of beer, a weak beer, and kippered fish, smoked fish. So that might be something someone would consume as a light breakfast. You might say beer. Often when I take students through the Timken and we have to tell them what's in the cup, their beer at breakfast, I said, well, water sometimes was contaminated, and these are very low alcoholic beverages. Now, the smoker's requisite, we see the smoldering ashes. Here we have the tobacco container and the pipes. And so what this is a combination. Pieter Claesz did a very amazing, had a very amazing ability to capture almost photographically real images. He studied light. He was aware of the idea of light and its profound effects. You can see that the light falls into this pewter top. It even reflects some of the things that are going on outside of this particular area. The other thing you see is the use of beautiful shadowing, and that he models this terracotta picture so beautifully. Now, something that is of quite interest to me is that this plate is cantilevered over the desktop, tabletop. Well, what does that show? It shows his ability as an artist to capture this kind of three-dimensionality. And it would be kind of an advertisement for his ability to paint. And that therefore he might acquire more collectors. The other thing is that this is a very rough hewn tabletop. And that is because sometimes before the 1650s in Holland, we had more of the basic elements of items that you might find in a Dutch household. As we get to 1650 and beyond, we start seeing more and more exotic objects because more and more trade and exploration is occurring. So the Dutch traders are bringing back these amazing objects, carpets, and even flowers that come from other regions. And it's really important to note when we look at tulips, for example, these are carnations, but the tulips came from Turkey in about 1559. And so the Dutch became enamored for about 60 years. They became enamored with these tulips to such a degree that in the early part of the 17th century, tulip trading had to be outlawed because it was really bringing down the economy. People were trading in tulip ventures and were trading at such astronomical sums that people were becoming bankrupt. So there's a whole separate idea that's happening in Holland with shown in still lifes called Tulipomania. And that's actually the title of a book you might want to check out. All right, this is our very own Timken still life, and it happens to be Italian. You see less Italian still lifes than you do, let's say, in Holland and Belgium at this time. But this is a remarkable still life, and it is, we do not know, it's anonymous. And what do we have here? Well, this is a vanitas. And a vanitas is a type of painting that reveals subliminal messages in more of a religious connotation. And why, how do we see that? Well, for example, flowers relate to the brevity of life. And in so many of these still lives that I'm going to show you, there's this concept, ars longa, vita brevis, which means art is long and life is short. And so they capture the beauty of flowers, but they also show the waning of flowers. So when a flower is picked, the bud is closed and beautiful like a young person, but as the flowers open, we begin to think of our mortality. And these flowers are waning. The stems are drooping, the flowers are drooping here. Now, we have some other elements in this painting that also point out to this concept. We have a twined rope wrapped around this sort of wine bottle type vase, and it also shows the unwinding of life. So again, we have this secondary relationship to ars longa, vita brevis. Thirdly, we have the butterfly. Now, the butterfly can relate to redemption, but it can also relate to its short lifespan. So all in all, this is a still life if you look at it, how interesting, but it does have a lot of these underlying undercurrents of meaning. Also, the salamander sort of looks on with a little bit of an evil intent, and that can relate to the idea of decay. Also, when I talked earlier about chiaroscuro, I show you that this contrast of light and dark is very popular in the Italians and with the Spanish painters. They use also a thing called tenebrism, and we're going to see that when we look at a little bit further on. So this is one of our Timken still lifes, and it does relate to the idea of brevity in our lives. Now, Pieter Claesz was a contemporary of our Pieter Claesz. They worked together, they knew each other, they worked in Haarlem, but his style is slightly different. He had a tendency to use more elaborate still life displays. And we have here something I wanted to point out. Okay, so there's a word called pronk, and pronk in Dutch means display. But we can extend that idea of pronk into what's called pronk stilleven. Pronk, P-R-O-N-K, still, S-T-I-L-L, even, E-V-E-N. And that really extends to a more ornate or elaborate display. And Claesz Heade was known for that. So here we have some really elaborate cloth, or probably like some type of silk or cotton, really beautiful. Remember, Harlem had the bleaching fields of linen. So that would be probably why that is here. Now, what is the lemon? Citron or lemon is exotic. It shows their ability to travel in faraway places. And we also have a roamer. And a roamer would be a large wine goblet that had these sharp little projections. And what that was used for is when you hoist a large wine goblet, it might slip from your hands. And so therefore you want something that would hold on. The other thing is we have these exquisite reflections in the silver and this elaborate container that has actually the god Hermes at the top, god of the wind, standing on the wind. And then we have this turned over silver tazo. And of course, some Venetian glass. Now, glass was manufactured in Holland as well as Venice. What does the oysters represent? Well, oysters were really more of a plain food. It wasn't like lobster, but it had a couple meanings. It had the meaning of fertility, the open lobster shell, but some people liken it to brothels. So often the Dutch would comment on temperance. When something falls over, you have to be a little bit careful that it doesn't extend to breaking and that sort of thing. So often it comments on temperance and moderation, which was part of the Dutch way of thinking. Remember, they were Calvinists and Lutherans and Church of Holland. And so they had a less of an interest in sort of a elaborate lifestyle. So this is a beautiful Dutch still life. And again, it shows the wares that were collected through travel. It is not religious. Remember, at this time we had the Counter-Reformation, but the Dutch were not Catholic. So they were not part of that. And it shows their ability to trade. They also had a very strong military. And then, of course, their interest in faraway places. Now, we will move on to one more Pieter Claesz Heade. I just wanted to kind of compare it to the two paintings we saw previously. Here he puts the paintings more to the front of the canvas, and we have a very exquisite monochromatic palette, which I just find so beautiful, these grays and greens and a little bit light yellow. Now, when I mentioned Momento Mori or Vanitas, this kind of shows it because here, remember I showed you the roamer would have these very definite projections here. Here we have one that is shattered. And of course, it does relate to this moderation and temperance. And we have this overturned dish, the same thing. If we don't watch our behavior, it's a little moralizing. Again, the oysters for fertility, or maybe, the thing about brothels I mentioned. So maybe it's talking about temperance, moderation, and alcohol consumption. And then we have these exquisite reflections. Many times we can even see other elements of the still life reflected here in this wine goblet. Now, an artist that I became very enamored with is George Flegel. George Flegel was a German. He was considered the first German still life painter. He did study the work of some of the Dutch still life painters, so there is that connection. However, he was different. He was different in that there wasn't a moralizing overtone to this painting. It was more of showing this display of a more upper class or bourgeois home. We're moving away from the depiction of the aristocracy and more into the middle class. So this would be a more affluent middle class home. We also see his influence of the Italian. He did look at Italian painting and also sort of Italian container, but we have very Dutch or Flemish flower arrangement. Here we also have this plate of, it looks almost like shells, and we have figs and fruit and the pomegranate. Well, the pomegranate relates to Greek mythology, Persephone. Remember, she went to the underworld, she ate 6 seeds of the pomegranate, and Hades told her, you know, you've eaten 6 fruit of the underworld, and therefore you will spend 6 months of the year underground and 6 months above ground. And that's why we have winter and fall and summer and spring, according to Greek mythology. We also have a parrot. Now, the great Franz Schneider, who worked with uh, Peter Paul Rubens, and Rubens also was a very gifted still life painter. He often did the animals in some of Franz Hall's works. So animals had a very interesting history with these paintings. But in this case, we're not sure that does it represent wisdom, or is it just a decorative element? But look at his exquisite use of color, his ability to create this kind of shadowing and three-dimensionality. So it is more, and we have a butterfly. So perhaps he is commenting on the brevity of life, or maybe redemption, but it isn't so overtly moralizing, which many of the Dutch did. But we do have this cantilevered uh, knife. We have the beautiful detail of everything from the open walnuts, the glass with the reflections. And I became just so captivated by his paintings. And I have begun to kind of do a study on them because they're so remarkable. Now we're going to go on to Jan Davids de Heem. And as I mentioned earlier, de Heem is one of the greatest still life painters of the 17th century. He worked in both Flemish and Dutch areas, Utrecht and also Antwerp. Now, in Antwerp, he encountered Frans Hals, although he lived longer than Hals. And he also began to look at how flowers were represented in both states or both areas. And here we have a profusion of many different kinds of flowers. And as I mentioned earlier, these flowers would not all be blooming at the same time. So it's a composite image, but we have the beautiful tulips that so captivated the Dutch. And again, where does the tulips, they came from Russia into Turkey, the steppes of Russia into Turkey, and then the Turkish nobility really, the Sultan and so forth, really became enamored with them. Tulip is the word for turban. And you can see they kind of have that, I apologize, they kind of have that look to them. So we can see that sort of turban. Now we have the shaft of wheat, which relates to the Eucharist. We have the snail and the salamander that could relate to sort of evil and decay. Oftentimes they do. But then we have some insects on a white flower, which would be more like purity. We have redemption with the butterfly, but also the brevity of life. We have all manner of exquisite flowers, carnations, tulips, vegetal elements here. And then this exquisite glass container where we can even see a beautiful reflection of a window here. So they're oftentimes bringing in elements of light to show the importance of it and their skill. Now, Wilhelm Kalf, another amazing still life painter. And the reason I want to bring this up is he does a more vertical interpretation of a still life. Many of the ones we looked at were more horizontal. He builds it up in a triangular form, and he incorporates some really amazing objects from travels that the Dutch would have experienced. Remember, the Dutch were going all through, Africa, North Africa. They went into the Americas. And so you're going to be gathering some of these exquisite elements. This is a Chinese ginger jar. We have a Turkish or Persian tapestry, absolutely beautiful with the tassels here. We have silver and crystal goblet. And we see this is an amazing sculptural feat. We have all kinds of embellishments on this large, tall, columnar type of wine glass. We have the citron, again, that comes from Spain or North Africa, and it also is rather exotic in nature. So this one perhaps is not so moralizing. It would be more we consider pronkstil-even. Pronkstil-even meaning this grand display of objects that would be collected by the Dutch or Flemish traders. Now, as I mentioned, The Dutch were more middle class. They were traders and merchants, and they wanted to decorate their homes and gather objects to embellish these beautiful homes. And they were less interested, again, in overtly religious subject matter. However, they did, like, for example, crucifixions, annunciations, because they were no longer Catholic. Although a small segment of Holland still retained a Catholic population. In fact, Jan Vermeer, our very own one of our favorites, Jan Vermeer, he actually was a Catholic and lived in the Papist, what they called Papist area of Holland, which in a way is a little bit of a pejorative term. Now, we're going to move on to look at some of the Spanish still lifes, because there were some remarkable still life painters among the Spanish Baroque artists. Now, remember, the Spanish Baroque artists are Catholic, and so there's a little bit more of a moralizing aspect to them. You know, some of them were involved with the Counter-Reformation. That means to promote the retention of the Catholic religion. But here we have one of the most remarkable still lifes I think I've ever seen, and it happens to be at our very own San Diego Museum of Art. So Juan Sanchez Coton actually eventually became a very devout monk, and he went into, he was a Carthusian monk, and he went into quiet monastery. But before he did join that monastery, he was a painter of strong convictions. And he does this remarkable still life that has so many mysterious elements to it. Well, first of all, let me talk about the fact that these are hanging objects. Why is that? Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, there was no refrigeration. And I, many years ago, after this time period, of course, but when I was a young graduate student, I spent some time in Spain, and we lived in a 17th century building. And it did not have hot water or refrigeration. And we often hung our fruits and vegetables on a little hook to keep it away from the bugs and away from the hot windowsill. So that is an aspect of refrigeration. So we have the quince, the cabbage, the melon, and the cucumber. So some of them are hanging. The other thing is it relates to the beginning of exploration with celestial bodies. Now, this is before the advent of Galileo and the telescope, which happens about 1609. However, the Spanish were and Italians were very interested in celestial navigation. And so therefore they were studying the heavenly bodies. A third thing is the way these objects are positioned. It could relate to a more esoteric concept, which would be Archimedes' hyperbole. And that is a mathematical philosophical concept that was also could have been part of Sanchez Coton's repertoire. So there's a lot of different elements that we're not 100% sure. But look at the mysterious quality. It's almost otherworldly. It's very deeply, profoundly beautiful, but it's so quiet. And you'll see that too when we look at Zurbaran's work. Now, the light falls. This is a form of tenebrism, which is even more intense than chiaroscuro, but we have this light falling on the open melon and the seeds. Now, these objects, cucumber, melon, cabbage, and quince, were actually elements, objects that were brought from Europe to the New World to be cultivated. So that's another aspect. It remarks on the age of exploration, which of course is in the 17th century and a little before. And he puts these elements in this recessed window seal with this inky black, and as the light falls, and we can see his signature here, we just get this altar, like this contemplative altar of a still life. So different. So let me just back up for a second and just show you the comparison. Now, of course, this was done much later, but if we look at, I'm going to try to get one that's a little earlier. We can see, 20 years before, this is a much more elaborate type of still life, but yet we have some of the same elements arranged on a more basic tabletop. This is like a windowsill. It isn't embellished with carpeting but very deeply, profoundly beautiful. Now, one of our great paintings in the Timken is St. Francis of Assisi. And it is done by Francisco de Zurbarán. And this is a painting by Zurbarán. It is not in the Timken. It also happens to be in the San Museum of Art, Agnus Dei, Lamb of God. So this represents that God died for his Christian brethren. And so we have this exquisitely detailed, but very profoundly sad image of a lamb, and he's either near death or deceased because we have his eyes closing, and we have the shadowing on the horns and the fluffy fur, but he's bound just as Christ was bound on the cross or nailed on the cross. We have this binding. And again, it's on this altar. Beyond a tabletop, this is an altar. Now, as I mentioned, the Spanish retained their Catholic religion, and they often did things that would be considered counter-Reformation. Remember the Reformation, which occurs in Holland, for example, and in other parts of Northern Europe. Many people were moving away from the Catholic religion, and the Catholic Church wanted to remind us in a rather kind of a propagandist way that Catholicism was beautiful and meaningful and important. And so these very overtly Catholic subject matter would relate to that. But again, Lamb of God, this is in the San Museum of Art, and it does show a momentum of death and also the crucifixion. Lastly, I could talk about this painting for hours. Of course, I won't because of time. This is only a 45-minute lecture. We want to have a few minutes for questions, of course. But I do want to talk about this painting. Pieter Claesz, who writes for The New Yorker, one of the best contemporary art historians, once did a piece in New Yorker, and he wrote about the compelling idea that this is probably the most important and beautiful still life ever created. It's a Spanish still life. But I have to agree with him. This is such a profoundly beautiful still life that it kind of takes my breath away. And it happens to be housed in the Norton Simon Museum of Art in Pasadena. And I often, 3 times a year, take a pilgrimage, not only to see the beauty of that museum and its collection, but just to stand in front of or sit in front of this painting. So let's talk about it. Francisco Zurbarán was very religious. He comes from the same town, Orgaz, that El Greco did, but his work is so different. He became very overtly religious, and he didn't paint that many still lifes. There's only a few extant. His son also was a still life painter and did concentrate mostly on still life, but he died young. So we don't have many of their works. Now, let's talk about this. He arranges it on an altar-like tabletop, and it's lined up right in a row. It isn't foreground, middle ground, and background. It's lined up in a row like an altar, and it represents almost 3 separate still lifes. We have the plate of citron, which is related to the lemon, the four citron with lots of light falling on it. We have this exquisite basket of oranges. Remember, oranges grow in Spain, and this detail, this woven basket that's so hyper real. And then we have the cup of water and the rose. And this is the most overly religious element to the still life because we are reminded of the purity of the Virgin Mary, and also the rose relates to her purity and the Virgin Mary. And it's in this beautiful cup with a silver plate. We also have the abundance of life here with these oranges, and then some relationship to Christianity here with the lemons. So his ability to capture something that really, in a sense, puts us in between the real world and the spiritual world. So this is almost as if we're at the brink of the spiritual world and leaving reality, in a sense, because it is so spiritual and enlightened and beautiful. So Zurbarán, who is known for his very overtly Catholic iconography and painting of saints and so forth, stops to make an exquisite interpretation of the spiritual nature of life and the Virgin Mary. Now, There are other still life painters beyond the 17th century, and Jean-Baptiste Chardin was one of them. He was considered probably the greatest still life painter, French still life painter of the 18th century in the time of the Rococo. Now, Marie Antoinette loved his work, and actually he worked for a time in the court, and so he was, I'm sorry, let's move on. He didn't necessarily work for Marie Antoinette. That's the next painter. I apologize. I got ahead of myself. But he did do some royal paintings for the royal families. He paints something very interesting here. This is a ray, and it almost looks like it's open, and you can see its flesh. And Proust, when he saw this painting, said it looks like the interior of a church, the nave of a church. It sort of has a sort of quality to it. And then we have a cat, and the cat is springing up, and we don't know quite what he's after. He's looking at the fish and the open oysters here. And then we have this kind of rudimentary glass and the tabletop and a saucepan. And what's interesting about this is Chardin was more interested in form and texture and less interested in moralizing. So if this had been a Dutch, for example, a Dutch still life, you might have thought of dead fish, brevity of life, the oysters, fertility, and so on and so forth. But this is more about texture and form and three-dimensionality. So we see this almost like a brick wall, and we have some recesses here, and we have the cat in motion, and we have this triangular formation. You see that the ray is hung on a hook. So again, it's less about moralizing and more about studying objects and texture. Now, just because we're kind of low on time, I want to go on to paint, yes, Anne Valier-Coster. Now, I apologize because my dates were completely off on the Rococo Marie Antoinette connection. She was a darling of Marie Antoinette. And you can see we're getting close to the French Revolution here. So what she was able to do is capture the exquisite nature of silver, for example, because her father was a silversmith. And then if you look at her ability to study and capture cloth, and that is because her mother was worked with tapestries at Gobelins. And so she had this rich background. And then, of course, she had the support of the queen. So Chardin is less Rococo, and I would say he's on the edge of Baroque and Rococo in the 18th century. But this painting, done about 60 years later, firmly places her, this female artist, in the Rococo. And again, as I mentioned, she was a darling of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. Now, if you look carefully, and it's kind of hard to see, in this silver Turin, we actually have a reflection, it's very hard to see, of her painting. Now, you can see a little bit of her. She actually captures in the shadow and light of the silver Turin her own painting. Now, what else do we have here? We have the lobster. And the lobster represents the affluence of this time. Remember, she worked for Marie Antoinette. And then the Dutch would also put them in the Pronkstil, this very elegant display of wealth. And so the Spanish, I forgot to mention the word bodegon. The bodegon were more everyday objects. So the Spanish, like in Zurbaran's case, or Coton, we see more everyday objects, which of course we mentioned was not really the case with the Dutch and Flemish. They loved to show ornate. The grapes here, which also had a religious bent, and these this covered jar, a little element of flowers here. So this was more on a horizontal format to show us the wealth of the patron. Now, we just have a few more, and I just want to, pardon me, go on. And we can't miss Raphael Peale, our own still life with vegetables. And here we have a really interesting still life. It's done in the early part of the 19th century. And Raphael Peale was from a very important artistic family. His father, there were many sons, and his father named many of his sons after great artists. And Raphael Peale was just this very very significant American still life painter. He captures a cutlet of meat that actually could have a couple different forms. It could be tantalizing the viewer to think about an upcoming meal, but it could also be the human body here, lying here with the cabbage and the asparagus and the chevrol and onions. So it could be commenting on the meat being a depiction of the human body, or it could be related to this tantalizing repast. Not for me, I don't eat red meat, but anyway, so again, it's on this sort of altar-like form, but it is not necessarily too religious in nature. Now we only have time for one or two more, but I do want to show you our Martin Johnson Heade. This is our amazing magnolia blossom. He did most of these on blue or brown cloth. This is one of the few, one and only, done on this remarkable velvet. He was a Hudson River painter, but he was second generation, and he went outside of America. He actually went to Brazil, painted all kinds of orchids and hummingbirds. And then he went on to reside for the rest of his life in Florida. While in St. Petersburg, Florida, he fell in love with these magnificent magnolia blossoms. And again, we can think about the waning, but here we have the strength and the power of this magnolia blossom just opening. And magnolia blossoms in art relate to self-esteem and power because they're a sturdy flower and a pure flower. So look how he captures the leaves and the twigs. Some of them are yellowed and some of them are still fresh and green. And he puts it again on this almost like altar-like tabletop. And we do have two more really quick still lifes I want to show you. This is by Henri Matisse. And this was done in 1901. Now, you know that modernism is beginning to emerge as early as like 1864, when we have Monet's Déjeuner se lève. We go into Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. And Matisse was also a Fauvist, and this is just about 5 years before his Fauvist period. But he was very interested in the work of Vincent van Gogh. And so as a young man, he was inspired by Van Gogh's work. Van Gogh, of course, died in 1890. So and Matisse in 1954. So Matisse was a young man when he saw Van Gogh's work, and he was so captured by the light and the sort of representation of sunlight and warmth, a la Vincent van Gogh. Also, Matisse did spend a lot of time in the south of France. He actually today has a home outside of Nice. You can visit, it's a museum. And he was captivated by the sunlight. So here we have these rather abstracted fruits. Remember, he was more interested in the kind of the quiet representation of things and more abstracted forms. You know, he was part of so many different movements, and he captures some of those elements. Of course, he was interested in what Cézanne was doing, but look at the more abstracted qualities of it. It actually looks like these pieces of fruit could actually slip down the tabletop. It's hard to even identify. This looks like something that would be used to draw juice from fruit. We have lemons and tomatoes. But again, this is a very modern interpretation of the still life. Lastly, I want to show you our very own John Peto. Now, Peto was really only discovered in about 1950. Many people thought it was this trompe l'oeil, fool the eye painter, Harkness, I believe, Harquet. I can't exactly remember, but they thought it was this completely other artist. And so he really wasn't discovered and realized he was a different painter until 1950, 1951. So what do we have here? We have this beautiful library, and we have a candle that is no longer lit. And so again, we have this sort of subliminal commentary on the brevity of life. The candle is half melted. If it was illuminated, we would think about life. If it's not illuminated, that means things are waning. We also look at this trompe l'oeil. It looks like we could actually reach out and touch some of the books. Books are old friends. Books relate to our history. Now, if you're a very young viewer, you'll probably think of books being so antiquated, but for those of us of much older generation, we treasure books. I'm the type of person I would not use an reading on iPad because I like the texture and feel of books. So he's commenting about life's wisdom that we gather as we get older. Our books become our friends. It is a very weathered, like books in a library. So this is, of course, our very own Pito, and it's one of the most recent paintings we do have in the Timken as here we are hedging into the 20th century. But look at his use of light. He definitely studied the Dutch and Flemish artists because we have this magnificent chiaroscuro here as it falls on the light of the books, and the pages are torn, and it just kind of captivates our attention. This sort of swirling mass of books and this very, very dark background. Now, because this talk is only 45 minutes, I hope we'll just have a couple minutes for some questions that you could have either put in the chat or ask right now.
Thank you so much, Karen. What a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Such an interesting topic with still lifes. You can kind of see the kind of progression of them. And so I love how you did this. So thank you so much. As Karen said, we can now take some questions. If you do have any, please feel free to go ahead and drop them in the chat, or you can ask them using your microphone if you would like. And again, if you are joining us over Facebook Live, you can use the comment section to ask any questions there too. I see Becky saying thank you, and excellent as always, Karen. So thank you so much. Perfect. I know that your specialty kind of area, Karen. So do you have any favorites that you've placed in?
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, it's so funny. I actually did my master's thesis on a San Francisco Bay Area painter named Paul Warner. He was a Bay Area figurative painter, and I didn't include it on this because it's a shorter thing, but he really did a contemporary or modern, let's say, interpretation of the Dutch and Flemish still life. But I think your question is so good, and I really think the Zurbaran, I just believe that's one of the most beautiful paintings extant in the world, and particularly in the genre of still life. So that was probably my favorite. I'd love to have that one. That you particularly, are you more inclined toward the Spanish still life painters or the Flemish or Dutch?
I personally love just the Dutch flowers. They're gorgeous. I could stand in front of those and look at each and every single one of the flowers for hours. So those ones are gorgeous, especially like, the elder one with just the giant, like the Llife with just masses of flowers. I love.
I would say that's one of my favorites too. That I would absolutely agree with that. And their ability to capture it such hyper realism, every petal, a dewdrop on a leaf. It's almost remarkable. And, I've actually had young people, when we do tours at the museum, which will be coming up in the fall, the Pieter Claesz, I've had students actually think it was a photograph. They don't realize that photography did not become a thing until 200 plus years after. But it's so hyper real that it almost captures it in a photographically photographic detail. Yeah,
that one's also really, really amazing. Well, thank you so much, Karen. I don't see any questions in the chat. I just see Lisa. Can you comment on the composition of the Zurbaran with items all separate versus the other paintings where the composition involves overlapping items?
Oh, that is a great question. And the reason for that is he is really putting it into the terribly sorry. Let's just look at it here. The religious realm. And the religious realm is he's actually creating an altar. Now, for example, for like the Dutch and the Flemish, they were building these displays. And that's why they use the word pronk, because pronk is really, I want to display my wealth, and especially when it's pronk still even. They want this grand display of objects. This is more, I wonder if you can see that, is the Zurbaran still life really is trying to show a separation. He creates an altar. Literally, each one is its own still life. Mm-hmm. So he's just kind of lining it up. So this is meant really for religious reasons. not so much as a commentary on the gathering of objects via travel and accumulation of wealth. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
That was a very good question, by the way.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I hope that answers your question. Perfect. So if we don't have any other questions, really quickly, I will just mention that, as I mentioned up top, this tour, is being recorded, and you can find this tour and any previous tours that we've done through the Timken on our Facebook and our YouTube page. And if you need any information for our future tours that are coming up, please check out our website as well. Oh, Nancy says, thank you, Karen. I was transported back to the 17th century using these beautiful paintings as a guide. I was captivated by the knowledge you shared with us this morning. Bravo. So thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you so much, Lisa. Okay, well, I hope everyone enjoys your morning and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much again, Karen.